Welcome to this event to mark the Men's Development Network's 25 years in existence as an NGO, working on issues to do with men, but impacting on all the family and society at large. We frame this work within the context of transforming masculinities and under the original mission statement of better lives for men, better lives for all. My name is John Doyle. I have been working with the Men's Development Network since 2006, and I'm currently the Director of Services with responsibility for the MEND program, the Male Advice Line, and the Counselling Service. Since the last 25 years, a significant piece of work delivered by the Men's Development Network has been our program for men who have been violent or abusive within the context of their intimate partner relationships. Now called the MEND program, it was originally called the Southeast Domestic Violence Intervention Program, but indeed its roots go even deeper than that, as we shall see soon. In our conversation today, we will look at how this work has developed, the interagency context, the work with the men, and the critical work with the partners and ex-partners of the men on the program. With me today, I have four people who have made significant contributions to delivery and the development of this significant piece of work, and were there right from the very beginning. So it's really a pleasure for me to have them with them and for you to be able to listen to their experiences as we look back right to the roots of the work those many years ago. I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to each of them, and we will then talk to them more fully later, and they can talk a bit about their own work and where they came from. But just to give you an introduction briefly, we have with us today Fran O'Grady, who was central to the initial setting up of the program and was a facilitator in the Wexford program for many years. Erica Ward, who works with Coonsair Women's Refuge and provides partner support to the South Tipperary program. Veronica Malone, who works now with Wexford Refuge and also provides partner support to the Wexford and Waterford programs. And finally, we have Sean Scanlon, who is now retired senior social worker with TUSLA, but again was there from the start and provided facilitation to the Carlo Kilkenny program. So you're all welcome to this conversation, really, to explore and to look at where we've come from as a program those many years ago, and to give people a sense of what it was like right at the start. So I'm going to begin by just asking Fran, who was there right at the beginning, to give us a sense of like what happened, how did it start, what was your interest, what was happening at the time. I know before this all happened, just to set a context for people, we did have the task force report on violence against women in 1997, and certain things I think began to happen around that time, but perhaps this happened more locally to begin with in Wexford. Can you talk us through, Fran, a bit how it developed and your role in that?
Yeah, thanks, John. Like many a good thing, it was accidental, actually, in a way. I was working at the time in the what was formerly called the Southeastern Health Board, and I had a regional post in the Health Board, and it was training for childcare services, which also included training in relation to domestic abuse. I'd had an interest in the whole area of domestic abuse going back a long time in Wexford, where we had put on a bit of pressure to get a kind of a campaign to get a refuge many years ago, and met a lot of resistance. But it was in my job as training officer at the time, training coordinator in the Southeast, that I met Phil Mortell and Sean Moriarty. Phil Mortell was principal social worker in Limerick, and Sean Moriarty was a principal probation officer, over a big area of the Southeast. Phil was doing training for us in the Southeastern Health Board. Sean will probably remember it at the time, on the Freedom of Information Act. And we were going from county to county doing the training, and he was chatting, you chat to me about what sort of things he was up to. And he told me a lot about, they were running a MOVE program in Limerick at the time. And he kept saying, I can't believe you haven't anything in the Southeast. I mean, surely you need a program like that in the Southeast and so on. And then he persuaded me to meet Sean Moriarty one day. I remember meeting him in the old Ordry Hotel in Waterford, which is long since gone. And Sean Moriarty was very, very enthusiastic about the work that we're doing in MOVE, and they were affiliated to MOVE Ireland. And they kind of said to me, look, you've lots of connections because you're in a regional post, you know, all the social workers and psychologists and nurses and so on. And why don't you set up a meeting and we'll talk to you? That's all you have to do. So I said, grand, I'll set up a meeting. And we had a meeting in June 2000. I remember it very well in Kilkenny. I was done under the auspices of my budget and all that kind of stuff. And they came along and spoke at the meeting and spoke with great passion about the work, actually. And I had invited a group of people that included like all the usual suspects in terms of social workers, psychologists, childcare workers, voluntary agencies, the refuges, and the Men's Development Network, which was then the Southeast Men's Network, I think it was called, through Alan O'Neill, whom I knew. So all those people came, and we had other community groups as well. We had kind of through the net fairly widely. We had 80 people there, and there was a great response to Sean, and I think it was their passion and commitment came through, and there was a great response to it. And I just couldn't let the opportunity go as a once off. And I sent around a piece of paper and said, anybody interested in getting involved? And 40 people signed up there and then. So that was the start of it. That was June 2000. And what we did, when I looked at the names, they were actually almost equally split between Carlow, Kilkenny, South Tipperary, Waterford and Wexford. So that was the origin of the four groups, really. And the origin of what we set up was 4 local committees. And there were multi-agency. I mean, we had the Wexford Local Partnership, we had probation. Yeah, probation were in from the start. Probation, social work, Women's Refuge, Rape Crisis Centre, all together in a room. And Gardaí, we had juvenile JLOs from the Gardaí and people like that. And each area was working away, beavering away, trying to sort of get something going. And then I would have regional meetings every so often to try to process what was happening. It wasn't always easy because in terms of, I can understand absolutely the women's refuges. There were some very big welcomes for the work, but there was also some suspicion about working with these men who were causing havoc in the lives of women and children. And that was absolutely understandable. So we had to do a lot of trashing out. And it was a very interesting time. And Alan O'Neill from the Men's Network was involved, very involved, and was very passionate about the work as well. So I continued in my role. I had a very nice boss, Peter Kieran, whom some people will know, and he was fine about me taking it on as part of my job, if you like. He had kind of a broad view of what my job entailed, and he looked at this as the area of prevention. So I continued to work with the Wexford group and the local groups to try to develop the service a bit. And then sometime, I think in the second year, Alan proposed that Men's Network would take over the coordination of it. Now, up to that, we had no funds or anything like that. I remember the first bit of funding we got in Wexford was a €1,000 grant from the Wexford County Partnership or something. And that was the first startup money we had. But Alan then proposed that they would, the Men's Network would take over the coordination. I was delighted because I had a lot of other things on my plate as well. And so he took over that role, and he was key then, involved in kind of organizing, the various steering committees and so on. And the first program that was run was 2 years later. We spent our time researching programs, and we liaised with MOVE people. They were the only people in Ireland at the time doing programs. Remember, we went to the Wicklow program and observed it and so on and so forth. And we set up the first program in Wexford 2 years later in 2002. So like it's on the go 20, like the start was 2000, that's 22 years ago. So I didn't realize that actually the Men's Development Network was quite new when we started all this. It was only 3 years in existence. That only occurred to me now. So I know that, just want to say one more thing. I don't want to hog this thing. Alan, one of Alan's key phrases he used to say, he used to quote an article by Nuala Fhailán, the late Nuala Fhailán, he used to write in the Irish Times, and writing about domestic abuse by men against women. She challenged men really in what she said. She said, men need to be part of the solution here. It's not just about women being the solution. And Alan took that very seriously. And I think he put a lot of energy and commitment in behind that statement and bringing it to fruition. And then, it developed from then, and funding came on board slowly at first and so on. and the programs developed into different kinds of programs, and the name changed and all that sort of stuff. I think that's maybe enough to start off with, John.
Yeah, thanks, Fran. That's really helpful, because it gives, I mean, and what really strikes me is how quickly things developed from that very initial positive response from the meeting you set up, to then having the 4 committees and so many agencies, statutory and non-statutory, involved right from the start. So it was quite a very positive move. And then you kind of hinted to the fact that there were some of the women's organizations might have found it a bit of a challenge to step in and find their place within the programs, and what way to respond to this initiative. And I'm just wondering, Erica, you were there as well quite early on in the process as a worker with Cuan Saor. I mean, I wonder, what was it like for you as you saw this development, or were invited into this development? It must have been quite a challenge to think about working within the context of the perpetrator programs, which weren't necessarily very fully welcomed into the scene at that time. So what were your thoughts as you were invited into this?
I imagine, no, they weren't fully welcomed, although I was lucky to work in a refuge that would have at least said, well, let's go and see what this is about, which I think was a very good starting point for it. The difficulty was, I think, in general, that would have looked at, will these men be able to talk their way out of everything? And will they be able to get away scot-free? And will, quite honestly, the people working with the men be smart enough to catch that? So there was a certain level of suspicion, and then funding is one very small pot between all the services right to this day. And was it going to take away funding from women and children, that we really needed that money? So from myself, I suppose I had worked in the refuge, started in 2000. So after the first 3 years, which is about 2003, I would have got involved with the very first, in those days, it was called the South Tip DVIP days. And the reason why I was interested in it was, I actually, working in the refuge, you see women who really want to keep the relationship going, but at the same time, the one thing they want is the abuse to stop. And you would see partners reuniting and reuniting time after again when they've left the refuge. And my thinking was, if we could offer the women and the children something that would add to their safety, then it was worth going to have a look what MEND was all about. So that was my initial reason to go to MEND. The other reason that I felt was very important was to look at, domestic violence services, even to this day, are largely focused on women and children, especially on the women. And a lot of responsibility is left at the woman's door. And quite honestly, other than the MEND program, there is no way for the men who are abusive to be held accountable. And this is the perfect way to get them to be held accountable. So I suppose those were my challenges. And I can only say it's mind-boggling to think it's 20 years that we're sitting here. But it has been a really good journey, and long may it last.
Erica. Yeah, and I think going back to Alan O'Neill, who was the founder and CEO at the time of the Men's Development Network, that this idea that men should be stepping in to do two things: to hold men to account to a certain extent around the behavior, but also to support them to make real changes. And I think the MEND, or as it was then the SEDVIP, provided a context for that, and so it was trying to do both things at one time, to hold men to account, but also to give them the capacity to be more responsible and to behave differently, and thus hopefully making it a more safer environment for women and children. Veronica, you also came into the situation there as a worker in Waterford. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm sure you had similar concerns that Erica has voiced, but was there anything particular from your background and your experience that you brought or had concerns or interests or, you know, were curious about this work?
I was facilitating a group for supporting women who had left abusive relationships, and same as Erica, a lot of them wanted to have a better relationship with their partners or their ex-partners. And I was at a local area network meeting when Alan came looking for volunteers to join, and I just thought the concept was brilliant, because at the time there was nowhere for men to go. And what was happening, they were starting up another relationship, and the abuse was continuing. So I thought, I jumped on the bandwagon. I thought, this is great. It's somewhere that you can help the women and children, and the man can get help. And if they are still together, we can support them. And if they're separated, we can help them in that process as well, just to make everybody's life better and hopefully easier. So yeah, I was very interested in that. And I can't believe, I think that was 2001 when Alan came. So from there to here, the first couple of years, it was putting our heads together. What's the best way to work with this? Where are you going to make things worse if you're giving the man a stage to speak from? And even back then, like, there was a lot of, you know, why doesn't she leave? Why is she still with him if it's so bad? Why? So I'd like to think that has a sort of changed. It's still out there a bit, but I think that voice has sort of quietened down as well. And I suppose it was scary in the beginning, because you didn't know if you were making things worse, if you were improving. We just didn't know, because we had very little to go on. It was uncharted territory. And like Fran was saying, there was some groups out there that were very skeptical about working with abusive men. But for me, how do you stop the abuse if you don't work with the perpetrator? So that's why I got involved. And I think you do need to work with the men to change that behaviour.
Thanks, Monica. It's interesting. Both yourself and Erica are saying that it wasn't just looking at the men, it was also looking at what workers with women were hearing on the front line, that the women were looking for support for the men to change, especially if they were going to be contemplating going back into the relationships. So there's that sense that it wasn't just responding to supporting men or challenging men, but also responding to what was a need of women to have, you know, not just the men held to account, but the men getting some intervention that might mean that they would be more abuse or more respectful or non-violent in their relationships. And both of you have, you know, echoed the challenges about, well, what will happen to these men if they come together? Will they be getting better or getting worse? Will there be collusion? What are the risk issues with bringing men together? And so that whole issue was handed nicely over to the facilitators in terms of having to get men together and then to have them in a room. And Sean, you were left there with that challenge, and Fran as well, and you can come in on this, Fran. But Sean, first, what was it like in a way? I mean, you were a social worker, so certainly these men were not an unknown entity to you to a certain extent, but you were working with them in a different context with maybe different policies or guidelines. Again, well, what was your interest in taking up the work, and what was it like to prepare and think about seeing that first group of men?
John, that's an interesting question, I suppose, really. Fran reminded me of names from the past when she began speaking earlier, people like Phil Martell, Alan O'Neill. I remember going to that initial meeting. Fran was one of those social workers. And I suppose one of the issues with social work then and now, in fact, is that while we sat on a lot of couches, and of course that time has become much less now sitting on couches, social workers are much more behind their laptops than sitting in people's front rooms or at kitchen tables. But the same issue, I think, is still very real, in that we meet women and children when we visit home, but we don't meet men a whole lot. COVID changed that slightly maybe, but not significantly enough. So one of the problems was we got a lot of referrals that referred to domestic abuse, but we always met the victims only, namely the women and children, and the children very much too. And I suppose that was our particular focus. But we rarely met the men, so they vanished. They either went to work or they disappeared out of the house when they knew somebody was coming. And generally they expected a woman, because, you know, that was the area. Women were social workers, men were builders. So this program, in a way, was an opportunity to engage with men at a level which, as social workers, we hadn't done before. So that was my initial interest, you know. And I'll slightly digress. Our eldest daughter, Saoirse, was home recently, and she had done a project in Glasgow for the BBC. And she was working as a researcher. And she was looking at two things, really. Why the lower on the social scale weren't engaging much with BBC TV, but she was also doing a piece of work with parents single parents who found it difficult to get their children out to school in time in the morning. And so there was a lot of time being lost by, again, single parents lower down on the social ladder who were struggling to get their children out early in the morning. And one of the things she said to me was, she said, Dad, it's difficult to engage social workers in this piece of research. And I said to her, sure, look, the benefits to be gained for social workers are massive, because there'll be a huge spin-off in terms of their work. But again, it was the old problem. We're too busy as social workers. Caseloads are too big to get involved in these pieces of work. And it reminded me of my beginning with MEND. And I thought, you know, I got involved back then, I think, really because there was an opportunity to do something with men that wasn't available to us as social workers per se. And so initially, that was a commitment that was hard to make initially because of the time factor involved. And because we were getting into something new, we didn't know what the involvement might be and what the time commitment might be and what the spin-offs would be. But I think those of us who were interested realized that there would be a significant benefit to social work having this iron in the fire, so to speak, to work with men in a different way. But there was apprehension around the time and around the commitment. There was apprehension once the training kind of kicked off. And Sean O'Neill had already begun a men's group in Carlow, which I got involved in earlier on, again for the same reasons, but it wasn't around domestic abuse as such. It was just to try and engage men in looking at their own lives and looking at themselves emotionally, I suppose, in a new way. And that was interesting. But to get back to the MEND, or it was DVIP back then, and there were suspicions around. You referred to one or two of them there earlier, John. This notion that we'd get a room full of men who would share abusive tactics and who would educate each other together about becoming more abusive and more cunning and more psychologically aware of the damage they could do to women. Not so much their children, because they didn't acknowledge a whole lot that their behavior impacted on their children. They didn't acknowledge that their behavior impacted significantly on their partners either, for that matter. But that was a big anxiety, that we could be having an open university for men to develop tactics and tricks and skills to abuse women even more than they were doing already. But and so in the very early stages, it kicked off, and it was a very different program to what it later became. It was more an educative process to begin with, where as facilitators, we were very anxious about delivering the program properly and appropriately and getting through the content and challenging men, but challenging men from a kind of an understanding point of view rather than from a deeper emotional connection point of view, you know, that we would challenge their reasoning and their motivation and what they were about in their abusive behavior. And the program developed. We began in Carlow Kilkenny with 4 facilitators running every program. And there was some continuity because a facilitator who had been present the week before was always present on week 2, and so on down the line. But a very different program to what it fundamentally became subsequently. And I must say, the development of the program to a much more process-driven program than educative was much more beneficial and challenged men in a much more rooted and deeper manner than how we began initially, you know. But I suppose all things develop and change and move on, and that would certainly be the reality of the DVIP program and the changes that eventually became the MEND program as I knew it 4 or 5 years ago before I retired from the program.
Thanks, John. Fran, your work already your work was in the whole area of training, and you stepped in as facilitator as well. What was your sense as somebody who would be used to working with people within a group context and training and facilitation? What did you notice when you started the work with this particular cohort of men?
Me,
what struck you? Yeah, you. Yeah.
I'm just, when Sean was talking there, I was just remembering how paranoid we were in the beginning about the group of men we were going to be dealing with. You know, it was almost like we weren't quite sure what to expect. Would we be safe in the room with them? You know, we had all these questions about it. And then it was interesting when we met them, because when we met them for the assessment process, I think the assessment process is fantastic because it is so, it's very real and it's also very challenging. And I would think that for the men, you know, engaging in the assessment, it was the first time when they were really confronted with their behavior in a very detailed way. Instead of kind of a bland statement like this man is abusive to his partner, he had to say what exactly he did, whether it was kicked or hit or pushed or locked out or pulled hair or said verbal abuse or sexist remarks or damaged the children. You know, there was a huge litany that had to be gone through in a very real way. And I think it was very challenging and very good. And I think engaging with the men, I suppose, in a real way, and I think it's the only way for the change to happen, was, you know, you're meeting a part of them at their core, that you're trying to engage with a part that you know, will reflect on what they've done and want to make the changes, want to be motivated, not because there's a court case coming up or because they're going to be put out of the house, but because they actually want to be a better person. But to get there, I think it was always a challenge for me as a facilitator, and I'm sure for many others, to actually, you had to keep a really high index of suspicion that you were getting the whole story and the full story and so on. So yeah, on the one hand, you wanted to engage in a real way, but you couldn't be sucked in. So it's almost like you were doing a kind of a balancing act all the time. And I found that really difficult to manage in the beginning. But in terms of working with the men, I mean, I think the first week they come into a group, when you've done the assessment, generally speaking, they were really nervous. That was the thing that surprised me about them, even though we might have worked with them individually over maybe 4 or 6 or 8 week period or whatever, 10 week or more. But coming into the room, they were actually terrified of the first night and speaking in front of other men, that it wasn't usual for them and so on. But that the group situation was very supportive, I think, in terms of, I think they began to find that. So rather than passing on tips on how to, and we all had that thing, it was almost like in prison, people will learn to, do drugs better, differently, etc., do the crime a bit better. We were afraid of that as well, like Shauna said. But actually, in general, and not always, in general, I think the atmosphere in the groups and the men has been very supportive. The men have been supportive to each other. I think that is, but I think that balancing act of holding them responsible for the behavior and meeting them on a human level, where you can listen to them and say, yes, I know what you've done, without condemning them or blaming them out of hand, but holding them responsible, is just fundamental to the whole program, and such a balancing act. That whole bit is such a balancing act. And the whole time, we have to keep the women and children to the front of our minds, because we're on a highway to nowhere otherwise. If there's a chance, I'd love to come back a little bit about partner support in a while, because I think the nature of it maybe has changed from what we envisaged originally. And I think it's probably the one area that needs, it needs more funding, more time, more development as well, being front of house rather than kind of, I think it started as an add-on. I think it has developed largely through, the people like Veronica and Erica and Kathleen and Wexford and so on. But I still think there's a long way to go. And if there was a change I'd like to see that partner support becoming, a bigger issue in its own right. Because I think one of the things we noticed early on was that a lot of the men coming to our program, those women had never gone to refuges or had sought help from helplines. They were a different cohort of women. Mm-hmm. So they needed something else. But in the beginning, I think we were not intentionally, but almost disrespectfully using them as a verification of whether the man was telling the truth or not. And that is not partner support as far as I'm concerned, So I'd like to come back. I'd love to hear what the women have to say about that, what Eric and Veronica have to say about that, because I think it's a huge area for development.
I think just it's worth saying, in case people are listening into this, just to give a sense of what happens, because some people might know, because it is two very distinct pieces of work in a way. There's the one-to-one and group work with the men, while the partners or ex-partners have one-to-one support by the partner support workers. But that's by and large by phone. Initial assessments take place face-to-face, but the ongoing support work is on the phone. So, and that even that piece of work wasn't there right at the start. At the very beginning, these began as kind of men's groups looking at the issues, and they were to a certain extent isolated in that way. But it very quickly, the partner support piece was brought on board. So yeah, I think so. It is very much the more work is done with the man, because it's his behavior we're endeavoring to change, and support work is given to the partner. But it would be good to hear from certainly from Erica and Veronica about, and I think the other thing I would just add before they answer is there was there's a bit of a concern, certainly as a men's organization, that we don't stray into work that's been done to do work that would be the work of women's organizations. So there's that balance as well, I'm conscious of. But yeah, Veronica and Erica. Or Erica.
I just agree with what Fran said there, that I would have brought that up, that the majority of my women have never been touched with any services before. And I think that's a cohort of women that it's great to be able to link in with. And just about them linking in with us, it's completely voluntary for them. There's no onus on them, because it is the man's problem, it is his issue that's going on. But it is very valuable to the program that they do engage with us, because without their feedback, we don't know if the changes in the relationship are being made. We only have one side of the story, so it's great when the women do get involved, so that we can get both sides of the story and see the fuller picture. And can I just say as well, John, about 2 years ago, things are changing, that the judge awarded the MEND program money for counselling specifically for the women and children, which I just was blown away by that. I thought that was great. It wasn't requested from him. He took it on his own back to do that, and hopefully that will continue, because it has definitely benefited some of my women and their children.
That was great because it's the first time I think we did any extra direct work, which we didn't do the work with the children, but there was funding that we could give to outside counsellors to work directly with children, which was great. Erica, any comment about the partner support work?
Well, I would very much agree with what Fran and Veronica were saying. Do you know, in the beginning, I don't think we even had a proper assessment process for the women. You know, we didn't have anything on confidentiality. We didn't have anything. It was really complete new ground that we were trying to develop ourselves. If we look at what we are doing today and how things have expanded, the services that are there for the women, and there is a certain crossover, between a certain similarity between the work that we would do in the women's refuge with clients and that we would do with women who have no link to the women's refuge. Of course, we will always refer women on to the refuges for court accompaniment. They have the options of helplines if they need to contact. But in general, a lot of the women who are in the program don't want to engage with the refuges. And this is their one and only support avenue open to them. What we now have is a very complex assessment process. We have the weekly contact with the woman, and what we see over that long period of time that we would work with the women, the benefit to their confidence, the growth in confidence of the women, and equally then the children. Because when we look at, for example, the judges' funding that came in, and like with Veronica, women that I would have supported, the women and the children, looking at them being able to look at some of the issues, often women who land in an abusive relationship in the first place would have had huge childhood issues and childhood legacy issues, very often, again, growing up, witnessing abuse. So it's this normalized pattern of behavior that they never thought they would land up into. And for that, we have counseling available through the judges' money. For the children, there is art and play therapy. And what we're looking at now is almost the family really developing. Whether they stay together or not is really irrelevant, because what you do have is a more respectful relationship. If the relationship ends, a father who's more engaged with his children, if that's the way the relationship goes. And equally, we have had issues, we have had couples who have come back and said, look, we're falling back into old behavior, where the man can say, look, I am being abusive and I don't want to go down that road. So it's a whole development that is happening for both the man and the woman and the children.
And even if they decide to separate, we're there to support both sides through that as well, you know. We're not just there to keep them together.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It allows sorry, John.
No, go on, Erica.
It allows the woman to be more confident in whatever decision she would make, where she wouldn't have had the confidence in the beginning.
I was just going to echo that fact, what Veronica is saying, because there can be a misunderstanding that it's about keeping couples together or families together. And I know that you and Erica are very clear, make it clear right from the start that whatever the woman needs to do, and that might mean continuing to get a barring order or to continuing to move safely to separation. And I suppose that's one of the interesting things that I'm always conscious to feed back to people when they talk about the success or not of the program, that even if a woman leaves safely during a program that the man is on, that is a success, because somebody has successfully and safely gotten out of a relationship.
Absolutely.
And I think a lot of, I mean, I'm thinking back to the things that weren't there, like even when I only came into the program in 2006, and there were things that weren't there. We like things like child protection and policies and the risk management meetings we have. It started very much as a kind of a program, almost like you'd have an adult education program meeting on a Thursday. I mean, the programs were very much focused on the group and the partner support. And it was only, and I think this is what you've all, and I think this is the great thing about it for me, is that people were courageous enough to make a start, knowing they didn't have everything in place. But if you wait to have everything in place before you start something, you generally never start. So I think there were things that then, as we progressed, we realized, oh, look, we need to have this, we need to have that. And I think we have put together a fairly comprehensive program.
Yeah,
Fran?
when we started, John, we were following the MOVE program. We were called MOVE in Wexford, and Southeast we were called MOVE. And we were following the MOVE program, which was basically like a 12-step program. You had you had a topic. There was about 13 different topics. You went in and you read through it and you discussed it. That was it. Like that was, and it was up to the facilitators and so on, to what level they would discuss it with. But it was kind of an educational program, but it was never going to be a behavior change at maybe a deep enough level. And I mean, MOVE as well, we're saying that, the programs needed to develop. We needed, as we got to know the group of men and realized that they were human beings with, that you could reach in terms of their feelings and so on. And because if I sounded negative about the men earlier on, I've surprised myself as how incredibly engaged you get with some of the men, and how you feel for them, really, I suppose, on an empathic level, how you really do feel for them at a deep level, and hope that your challenging of them will support them to make the changes they need to make. But I think we began to wasn't adequate. And we had that period of time where we used to go to England once a year, somewhere in the UK, and have those network meetings, which were amazing. Like, there's all these groups all over the UK running these programs. I only went once, but I was flabbergasted by, it was just amazing how it happened. And we began to see, in terms of the way they engage in the programs and the way they organize partner support work as well. It was completely different. And then I think the funding began to, Alan was tipping away at the Department of Justice. We always tried to make sure the Department of Justice would fund us rather than health, because we didn't want to interfere with the funding that was going to the refuges. And when the funding began to come, then we began to get training. We began to get training with it. And that was fantastic. And John, you've been very involved in organising training for us. It has made such a big difference with kind of people coming over, doing training on the various things, including Paul Wolflight and others, and Kelly and Dave now with the new programme, the Choices programme. But all those, they were just mind-blowing, those meetings, and just seeing what's happening in other parts of the world, that was just amazing. It was so developed. But I do remember, and I just want to say this because it always struck me, Paul Wolflight, whom you all know, I'm sure, from all the training he gave us, talking one time about how challenging the program is for men, and when you're really challenging them, how really difficult it is, and how some of the men, and he would say that he'd had men in the group who had been through a lot of tough situations in their life and had caused a lot of havoc on their life. They'd say that it would be easier to go to jail for 6 months than to go through a program where they're being challenged all the time, because it's very tough at a different level. There's nowhere to hide. If the program is running well, and if you're really being challenged, that there is nowhere to hide. And, we'd have seen men devastated at nights, particularly Sean mentioned in relation to kind of children. It's funny, but I don't know, it always struck me that it was easier for the man to reach that sort of place in himself where he really felt for what he had done to his children, or what his behavior had caused. He would get to that place more quickly than the place where he understood what his behavior had meant to his partner. And you'd have men, some of the exercises are very powerful in the program, and some of the role plays, and you'd have men really literally in bits because of what had happened. So the program has developed hugely in terms of, like, from the start where we came, and as you say, if we hadn't started, we'd never have started. We're waiting for it to be perfect. But the training has been enormous, and I think supervision is such a key, because of that delicate balancing act of not getting overly sympathetic or involved and keeping the woman and the child in front of your head all the time. It's just so important, you know.
So
I've said enough. Thank you.
so much developed and changed over the years, really. The whole assessment process
Yeah.
became much deeper and much more challenging for the men. And we began to realize that so much more work could be done in the assessment process,
Right.
and doing a lot of that work then rather than on the program. But one of the things that always struck me, and you mentioned it again there, Fran, was the enormity of what the men were committing to, you know. A 6-month program was massive, and people would say to me sometimes, and how often do they go along, Sean? And I'd say, well, once every week for the best part of nearly 3 hours. And they'd say, what? You know, as much as, how do you get them to do that? So the enormity of the commitment was huge. And as we know, a lot of men stuck with it. Some didn't, unfortunately, and left our programs. But so much had changed in the 10, 15 years that I was certainly involved in the program. And, you know, moving men from shame and guilt to remorse and an emotional connection to how they were behaving, because, you know, things like shame and guilt only blocked them from moving on, really, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Once you got under some of those and down to that deeper level, there was some significant change in many of the men. I won't say most of the men, because I suppose that's one of the weaknesses of the program, maybe, that there's no long-term evaluation of the whole process that we involve the men in, you know. And that would be fantastic, of course, if that was more available to us, really, as kind of a longitudinal study of the relationships, particularly from the women's point of view. Was there a significant change in the man's behavior, and was there a much greater emotional connectivity with his partner than there was when he came on the program, you know? Because I suppose at the end of the day, that's the significant change, really, that emotional
Exactly.
connection between the man and his behavior and its impact on his partner, and how much better the relationship could be if that was respectful, you know, and if that was obviously totally less physical.
But saying it's important from
emotional connectivity between the partner's needs and her as a person and individual, and the man understanding that more and more, and the damage his behavior does to that and to the relationship. But that was where the program was moving, you know, and from early beginnings to move to that stage, I thought was a massive shift and a massive change, and brought huge benefits to the men on the program than the earlier sort of guinea pigs that we might have had when the program kicked off at the beginning, you know.
Veronica, you're going to come in. Thanks, Sean.
I was just going to say that working with the women, one of the big things is showing them that they're not responsible for his behavior, and for him to take responsibility for his behavior. And sometimes you can come up against a wall with that, you know, so it takes time. So working with the women and one-to-one is really invaluable to help them change their way of thinking, that if they done this, he wouldn't have done that. You know, so that for me anyway, that's one of the major learning points working with the women, is for them not to take responsibility for his behavior.
You know, for the men to recognize that they were great for blaming, you know.
And women are taking the blame.
Yeah, and a lot of women took the blame, I suppose, sadly, you know. But the men were great at sort of hanging their behavior on them, you know. And for a long time in the program, many men would believe that if they had a different model, so to speak, in their lives, they'd be better men, you know. And of course, it was the biggest form of, it was the biggest mythological lie that they could take on board, you know, because as we know, many of these men moved on through different women, to different partners, and their behavior never
Same
changed.
behavior.
Different model, but same behavior, you know.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's one of the things we have had that right from the start, I think. I mean, the good thing was that we went to places like Respect in the UK and that national practitioners networking meeting that Fran spoke about. And while there was a great deal of variety of approaches, each program tended to have the same basic principles of, you know, the primary aim being the safety and well-being of women and children and holding men to account. And I think if you get those two in place correctly with your risk management and your supervision, then you can do a lot of different things in terms of the way you run the program, how you work. You can do a lot of different things, but if you're holding those principles in place and keeping an ear for the facilitators to be keeping an ear for what's happening with the women and children who are not in the group, to keep an ear to that,
Very important.
is really helpful. And I think the other thing, maybe, don't know if it's worth talking about, but the interagency, like I'm conscious of the interagency relationships, well, maybe also the challenges, because there's a lot of relational work done in the program. What I mean by that, we're looking at a relationship of the man to his wife, we'll say, or his partner. But in the room, we have two facilitators who are having to relate, and often it's a male and a female. And then we have the relationship between the facilitators and the partner support workers. So I'm very conscious at the level of oversight that there's all of this relating going on, communication going on, and the challenges of miscommunication and misunderstanding and, you know, all of that. I wonder, like for any of you, how have you found it? And maybe even going back to the early days in terms of what were the challenges of relating as facilitators, as partner support workers, and the relationship then. I'm also thinking of our relationships with probation service, with TUSLA, with the judges, or, you know, and all of that system. Any memories or thoughts about those relationships and the challenges of them?
Well, I suppose the big relationships, number one, the benefit of the training, not only being able to hear what the programs were about, what they were doing in England, but the benefit to ourselves of facilitators and partner support meeting with each other. And it was a real bonding exercise that I think we really needed, because in the beginning, you know, there can be a lot of suspicion between facilitators and partner support, especially when a facilitator, I believe his version of the story, and the partner support, I believe her version of the story. You know, you have to be very, very skilled in order to be able to realize, hang on a second, we may be pitted against each other. We've got to overcome this and move on as a unit. Risk management has been very, very good to help us through that, as has the supervision. I do think supervision together, it might be individual, it's very good, but also once in a while, I think for the partner support and facilitators, especially when groups are in process, to have that supervision opportunity together. So, and then I suppose how things have moved on, you know, with data protection, social workers, especially the new child protection regulations, when they came out, mandatory reporting became an issue. We have a lot more to do with social workers who do have the power to mandate both women and children, women and partners onto the program. So, you know, we have that is new for us to work with. How do we break through the barrier that we're not quasi-social workers, but we are here to support the woman, or for facilitators to support the man in changing his behavior. So there's a whole new dimension, and there is the thing now that do we get into child protection, into childcare case conferences? Is this heading towards we're going to be in the court system? You know, so there's a lot of new things happening. And then luckily, John, that's your baby, the funding, but that is always there in the background.
Suppose when you begin to compare it with the early days, John, it seemed like the doors opened and the wind began to blow through almost, you know, but the connectivity between all of us increased significantly, you know. Facilitators and partner support, joint training came on board. Risk assessment was a big step really when that really got up and going. When we could ring each other and have conversations on the phone and, you know, raise concerns and get good feedback from partner support. They were all significant changes really for us, I think, as facilitators of programs, you know, because we came back into that room on a Monday or a Tuesday night with a much bigger toolbox, if you like, you know, and a much better informed consciousness of the men in the room, you know, the fellas who were trying to pull the wool over us as facilitators, and that co-working with facilitators was, I think, was maybe one of the best and the biggest changes of all, really, that Erica or Veronica might say to us, and Carol Kilkenny and so to lads, you know, take the blinkers off, like, listen, you know, listen to us, like, some of these guys are, you know, they're, and like, there were no monsters in the rooms, you know, there were lovely men, very nice, very welcoming, and some would have run the group for you, you know, but behind it all, like, you know, there were abusive men, and sometimes you had to realize that because they were presenting as, you know, angels on the head of a pin, and a lot of the connectivity with partner support destroyed those kind of myths really, and to be able to pick up a phone and check right up to the evening before a session was great, you know, and you went in with a different view of John or Mick or Peter, and with that information you were able to challenge in a respectfully, but in a much deeper and stronger way, you know.
And it's probably one of the most challenging aspects of the work, I think, really. And I listened to what you're saying about the relational stuff, and I suppose the key one is the partner support and the facilitators. That's the key one. And the social work one, I think, has developed a good bit as well. And it can be tricky as well, because how much we report to social work really depends on, you know, we have to be very careful. We don't, you know, it's a confidential thing, apart from obviously child protection concerns have to report, etc., etc. But I know there have been many times when facilitators have been gutted on the evening just before the group, an hour before the group, hearing about something that went on that week that they weren't expecting, and really not wanting to hear it, not wanting to take it on board, but having to. And, you know, almost wishing they hadn't made that phone call to the partner support worker and just carried on regardless. And then having to find a way to, it's always been tricky, a way to manage the evening where you don't divulge information that has come from the partner, but somehow it has to come into the room as well in a different way. But I think, I just want to say to the partner support workers, Veronica and Erica and all the others, Kathleen and all the others, that I just think they've been amazing in terms of actually keeping the door open to us with our, sometimes our kind of blinkered approach, and wanting to believe that everything is better than it is, you know, that almost that over optimism. I think when I started, I was certainly too optimistic. I was very too suspicious first, then too optimistic, and have got some kind of a balance as time went on. But I think for the partner support workers, they've had to really hold the line there and be very open to us in our whatever gullibility or whatever it is, you know, at times, and nudge us into the reality of situations, because without the reality, the change isn't going to happen. So I think that's such a key relationship with the whole thing, such a key. It has to be, by its nature, has to be challenging.
Just to say, Fran, that can come from the other side. Sometimes the man may be disclosing issues going on, and the woman may not disclose us because she's protecting him. She doesn't want to bring it in. So I'm sure Erica is the same. We're well aware of the difficulty of knowing information you can't bring into the room, and you have to try and bring it in an unconscious way, sort of, or and that's a skill in itself, learning how to do it. Because we can't.
But also the thing about, I don't want to hear this. I thought he was getting better. I don't want to hear, that kind of thing. And then the phone call. So challenging.
We're the work is challenging. The woman is doing great, and then we hear this is going on and she hasn't disclosed. So it does change your way of thinking. It does affect you. So I'm sure Erica will agree that we can understand how difficult it can be for you as well.
And I think the good side of that, I would say, is that's where we are having to model respectful behavior for the clients, because we're having to listen and we're having to hear things we don't want to hear, and not just get into denial or blame, which can happen because we're all human. So I think I have seen that played out in my time, that people have been very respectful, and even if they've been resistant to hear that negative feedback, that generally people have just faced up to it and being professional and mature and then got on with it. Very challenging, and I think it has been a great piece of the work. Look, I'm conscious that we're out of time now, and that certainly has flown for me anyway. But I would like to ask you all just one, in a phrase, if I was to ask you, I can tell you that each of you have enriched the program down the years, because I know each of you and I know your work very well. And I know that has impacted on families in the Southeast and more general area. But I'm wondering, in what way would you say the work has enriched you? What have you taken out of the work? How has it enriched you by being part of this very challenging work? And it's just one way, and it could be, and just a phrase or a sense of how has it impacted on you as a person to be involved in this quite challenging work?
Good question, John.
I think for me, sorry.
Okay, Fran, and then Sean.
I think it's for me supporting a couple through a bad phase in their relationship, and whether they stay together or whether they separate, that we can support them to do that and help make a change in their lives and their children's lives. And another thing is for me is that a lot of women that I contact have not been in contact with any services before, never spoken about their relationship, and so that's a big thing for me, that we're reaching women who might otherwise not be on the radar.
Fran, you're coming in there.
I think I'd say like that, it's such complex work and very challenging, but has been very enriching at a personal level. I have found it very enriching, and I hate using that word privilege, but it's kind of like people. I'm amazed at how much people let us into their lives and trust us with, stuff that we don't talk to other people about. It's human stuff, human emotions. I mean, every relationship has issues, and some go deeper and are more destructive than others, but they're there in all relationships. And the fact that people, the men and the women, have opened up to such an extent and let us in there, it is kind of, incredible at times. It kind of makes me feel a bit humble. But one thing that has often inspired me is when we would do the sessions on parenting, and they've developed a bit now, into maybe, more weeks. We used to always start with getting the men to name their children and, writing up the number of children and the ages on the board. And at the end of it, you're thinking, there's 25 children belong to these men. That some benefit is coming to their lives. This is, and that to me was kind of inspirational, that there were children out there that were benefiting directly, not just indirectly, directly from the work. It had to be happening. So that to me is a big thing I take away from it.
I would agree with you, Fran. It's one of the biggest joys of our work, I think, is to see how in our case, Veronica and mine, how the women develop in confidence, how they find their own voice. And we can see it in all areas because the woman is able to maybe find employment for the first time in her life, part of groups, part of schemes. It's a great thing. And likewise, through risk management, I know that this is also happening for the men. And it's that increase in confidence, irrespective of whether they stay together, as Veronica was saying, of the women, the children, but also the man. And it means that at the end of our involvement with them, they have an opportunity to be in a better place than they were in the beginning. And to me, that is what makes the work worthwhile. And long may it continue and carry on developing and growing, as I'm sure it will.
Thanks, Erica. Sean.
That sense of awakening, that Erica is talking about there in the men, from our point of view as facilitators, whether they stayed 2 months on the program or 6 months on the program and came back and did a second one, there must have been some kind of awakening in all of them because of the challenging nature of the work. And so that was enriching. I suppose being part of the whole debate as well around a very key issue, and the training and so on was the developmental nature of that in my own life was very enlightening, And I suppose then finally, as a man in the room, sharing some of the behaviors of the guys I'm working with, I mean, I wasn't standing up there like as the perfect male who was never abusive, I was standing there in the room as a male who was sometimes abusive in my own life. And I suppose the one thing, it challenged me week in, week out in my own relationship, both with my partner and my children, do I behave in that way sometimes, Do I do that? Do I not listen? Do I blame? So I was bringing that kind of home sometimes, asking myself, and I haven't got there yet, I clearly acknowledge that. But from that point of view, it was challenging and learning and improve me as a person,
Thanks, Sean. And I think that's a great note to end on in a way, because it shows that we're all people and we all have our challenges, and that we were working with these men not in a way where we were just pointing the finger, but we were there on a learning curve ourselves, and we were impacted by what was happening in the room, and we were shaped by it as well, and all our relationships. And in a way, I think that echoes probably Paul Wolflight's approach, which is, if you're to change any situation, you've got to be present in it in a real, authentic way, and not just as somebody coming in a judgmental, distant way. So what you're echoing there, Sean, and all of you is that you've really invested both professionally and personally in the work over the years, and that is a testament to yourselves, and I think to the value of the work for those men, women, and children, because they will have picked that up directly or indirectly. So I just want to thank you all for coming on this program, this conversation, today, and thank you, and thanks to everybody who has listened to this later on when we put it on our social media. So thanks everyone, and goodbye.